We've already examined Resident Evil Requiem running on the bigger consoles, but we were excited to see how the game would run on Nintendo Switch 2. Thus, we've decided to do a separate video focusing on this version. After all, this is the first big new release powered by RE engines to ship on Nintendo's console, and previews had us extremely interested in seeing how it would turn out. The results are quite impressive. It's not perfect, but this is one of the best ports we've seen on the Switch 2 to date. And of course, I didn't do this part alone. I'm joined by Oliver McKenzie to talk about it.
Yes, John, I think this is one of the most exciting, intriguing Switch 2 ports we've seen so far. And it's actually surprisingly impressive in a lot of ways, I would say.
Looking to get your hands on a free Resident Evil Requiem PC game code? Well, MSI has the promotion for you. Purchase a select MSI gaming monitor or desktop PC, write a review on an eligible retail platform, register your product with MSI, submit your details, and the game code is yours up until the end of March or while stocks last. Check out the video description below for eligible hardware, terms and conditions, and to learn more.
I was curious to see how it would be cut back and how noticeable it would be in the end. And the answer is kind of mixed depending on what you're looking at. But I still think what we are looking at here is something on par with the Star Wars Outlaws port. It's a really, really great release that takes advantage of the Switch 2. And it stacks up well against its bigger brethren. So I actually think with that in mind, let's start with the comparison everybody's curious about. How does Switch 2 stack up against PlayStation 5?
Yeah, this is kind of a key comparison point because the PlayStation 5 version of this game, like it is with basically all the other games that we take a look at on consoles these days, is kind of like the canonical version. That is the version that most players, most home console players will be exposed to. So if the Switch 2 version can compare all right against PS5, that's quite an accomplishment. And I actually think, by and large, it does look fairly similar to PS5, certainly at a glance here. The graphics tech is largely preserved. The key issue here is there's no ray tracing tech on Switch 2, right? So the ray tracing tech that we see in PS5 Pro and PC that John has already talked about, that's not present here. But beyond that, pretty similar. Now, there is one fairly large visual settings difference that I think we can talk about here, which is that the Switch 2 gets the RE Engine card-based hair, whereas the PS5 uses the strand hair. And I think the PS5 looks quite a bit better here. Obviously, it's much more detailed. It's lit more realistically. It has appropriate gloss and sheen in like wet conditions. Moves more realistically. But Switch 2 with the card hair, it does not look too bad. It's not offensive looking or anything. I think the biggest difference are in like cutscenes and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's not a big deal, but I do think that this time it feels like the card hair was sort of like not
An afterthought
to the development team.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Because you look at Resident Evil 4, for instance, and due to the weird lighting issues, the card hair ended up looking kind of better on the consoles, right? But in this case, when you see the card hair, it's definitely not great. And this isn't the only version with the card hair, by the way, as we'll find out. But clearly they did at least improve the performance of the strand hair enough to reach a stable 60 on PS5, which was definitely not true with Resident Evil 4. So it's cool that it's been optimized, but it's still a bit much for a system like the Switch 2 and some others, as we'll see.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And definitely the strand hair makes more of a difference in this game than like Resident Evil 4, just because the nature of Grace's hairstyle in particular, right, with its long locks, they're nicely separated and stuff like that. With Leon's hair, didn't make as much of an impact, and then it had some problems, like you mentioned. But yeah, moving on here, textures are also lower res in places. But you have to look pretty close to spot any real differences. But broadly speaking, texture quality does seem lower in these shots. Not by too much, but it is lower.
In addition to the textures, they're also using lower quality models for all the character models, which turned out to be a setting in the PC version of the game as well. So this is designed for scaling to lower end systems such as the Steam Deck. And yeah, that's what we're getting here. What's interesting is that this is so expertly done because it's not something you'll probably be able to notice when you're just enjoying the game, right? But when you actually put it side by side, you actually see the polygon meshes get a little more rounded with the higher setting, and you don't see that on Switch 2. But again, it's like super minor. It's just, to me, I like this because this is an interesting sort of indicator of the types of optimizations that Capcom was doing to squeeze more performance out of it without massively sacrificing visual quality, right? That's
Yeah.
really, really good work. This is great optimization work. But then there's also the lighting and everything, right?
Yeah, the lighting here is, it's not that Capcom has stripped out any particular lighting effect. Like you get with the flashlight, you get like this SSGI effect going around the screen, which is quite nice looking. You also get SSR on like wet surfaces, glossy surfaces, things like this. And those are still present on Switch 2 and they still look good, I would say. But like in certain situations, you can definitely notice that they're noisier on Switch 2 and less detailed, which is kind of something you might expect as a function of resolution more than anything else here. But yeah, both machines rely heavily on SSR because they don't use RT reflections. And they also have like a cube map fallback in the mix. Very typical kind of current gen mix of specular reflection techniques here. But yeah, not too bad in either platform. There's other small cutbacks in the mix, like volumetric lighting is lower res on Switch 2, very, very common optimization. The drapery in this shot also seems to have a bit of a somewhat simplified, I think it's a pre-calculated simulation here on Switch 2. Not that that's a big issue throughout the game, but just with the wind blowing through, you do tend to notice that kind of chunkier look. And then other tweakables seem similar enough, like the shadows are pretty similar. The shadow maps look pretty similar, pretty equally chunky across both systems. Nothing's too different there. So yeah, overall, just in terms of those kind of core visual settings, I think we see some downgrades, but a lot of continuity, and more importantly, not differences that you'd really notice or would really stick out to you at first glance, except for that hair.
Exactly. I think hair is the only thing that really sticks out, and it's mainly an issue in cutscenes, I would argue.
Yeah.
But so it's not ruinous by any means. But really, I think what they've done here is just remarkable work. It's sort of slimming down the requirements of the whole game in very subtle, interesting ways that manages to maintain that original look. Like when you first load this up on the Switch 2 and you see that busy street scene running, it's like, wow. Like to my eyes, I was like, this is the best looking thing I've seen on the Switch 2. Like this is absolutely mind blowing to see this running on a portable piece of equipment like this. So really, really cool stuff. But what about image quality? Because this is something we've both looked at and the results are actually really, really interesting as well, right?
Yeah, the interesting element here to me, the really key element to me in this comparison, is that Switch 2 is operating from a quite low internal resolution. It's about 540p internal, whereas PS5 is about 1080p. But they actually end up comparing, they end up comparing fairly equivocally. They look fairly similar in a lot of respects, which is quite surprising. And of course, that's thanks to DLSS on the Switch side, presumably upsampling that to a much higher resolution output, probably like 1080p output or something in that range. Like if we look at this shot, like these wires here, Switch 2 is very soft but much more stable than PS5. Likewise with the fence beneath it. And I think that's largely because Switch 2 is using a DLSS. I think of the CNN variant, like the full-fat DLSS here, which is a much better upsampler than whatever PS5 is using. I actually suspect PS5 is perhaps just using FSR1 or another spatial upscaler.
Yeah, it's
Possibly
a spatial
not.
upscaling.
Yeah.
No sort of upsampling. They're not using the interlacing technique either. So it is the PS5 image treatment isn't as good as it could be, while Switch is better than you would expect.
Yeah. But the one key element here, though, that does confound our comparison somewhat is that the PS5 appears to have a film grain effect that isn't enabled on Switch 2.
Right.
So it kind of confuses things a little bit. But like overall, I would say that image quality is better on PS5 overall, but the end result can look quite competitive on Switch 2, especially in still shots where you give the image enough time to accumulate appropriate detail and appropriate anti-aliasing and all that good stuff. It can actually look very competitive in those shots. PS5 also has a 4K UI, Switch 2 has a 1080p UI, very, very typical split there. Then performance is another interesting question here. PS5 seems like a very stable performer from what I've seen. Now, maybe you can correct me on this, but it seems like basically a locked 60 FPS, at least in the early game. Maybe it gets a little bit dicier later on. I'm not quite sure, but at least it seems like a really strong performer in the early game that I've tested.
Oh, no. I mean, PS5 is basically perfect.
Yeah.
Like you can find a couple spots with some dips, but it's pretty... it's uncommon to the point where it's basically a non-issue, right? Yeah. So very, very smooth.
Switch 2 still targets 60 FPS, which is kind of ambitious when you think about it, especially when you think about the visual quality that's being delivered here to still target 60 FPS. That's pretty extraordinary. And it does hit 60 FPS, I would say, not a lot of the time, but in smaller scale sequences, right? The smaller scale sections of the hospitals, like some of the hallways, certainly the early section that you play that was also in the demo build, I believe, that you tried at Gamescom, that runs at 60 FPS largely. But in most content, it's somewhere in sometimes the 40s, sometimes the 50s, in larger areas, in larger rooms, even within the hospital, that will settle in that kind of area. The lowest I spotted docked was 30 FPS in a pretty strict area. So it can dip pretty low here, but by and large, it's like 40 to 60, which isn't too great. Now, Capcom seems to like running their games unlocked, which I'm not the biggest fan of. I think key here, if they had implemented a 40 FPS mode, I think that would have just been perfect for this game, or even a 30 FPS mode for 60 hertz displays, just to iron out those drops, maybe introduce dynamic res, do a couple things there. I think 40 FPS is quite achievable. But yeah, it's kind of unfortunate that it is unlocked. And of course, with Switch 2 in docked mode, you don't have any access to VR whatsoever. That's a limitation of the system as it's currently configured. But one possibly positive aspect of performance to close this out on is that loading times are very quick. So loading into a level cold is like 9 or 10 seconds in my experience. And reloading from death takes just a few seconds. Those are measured on the internal storage, not SD Express, of course, but I can't imagine it would be too much slower. Now, I think PS5 is like way faster than that in percentage terms, but in absolute terms, you're not going to be spending a lot of time on Switch 2 waiting for some loading screen. It's very, very fast, I would say.
I do want to comment one thing, though. So the performance profile here on Switch 2, like you said, it is very much what Capcom has always gone for, right? But it's fun if you look back at something like Resident Evil 4, because that actually did ship on last-gen consoles, and the performance there, like on PS4 Pro and such, and base PS4, it's actually very similar to what we see here, right? Like, it's just that unlocked frame rate with everything between 30 and 60 can happen, right? So it's kind of what you would expect if there was like a PS4 port of this, I would say. And it's not a comment about power or whatever. This is literally just like saying, like, this is the type of performance profile that we have seen on those systems, and they've opted for it again here for some reason. So, and I do think it would be nice to have a version of this with a cap, right?
Yeah, I would say so. Like, the absolute performance here is pretty good, is actually pretty great as far as these things go to run a current gen game at these frame rates, but obviously in the absence of VRR, in the absence of some kind of frame rate lock, it does not work so well.
Also worth noting, if you looked at Resident Evil 4, when you would run that on like Series X or PS5 or whatever with the hair strands and ray tracing turned on, then you were generally under 40 FPS and it was just completely unlocked. So that was on a powerful current gen system. So I can see why there was no ray tracing features here. And there's also no ray tracing on PS5. So, because it's heavy, man.
Yeah, and there's obviously no ray tracing on Series S either, which is a console I actually have not had the opportunity to play because of certain restrictions linked to consoles and codes here that are a little bit more draconian than with some other games we've tested. I've not played on Series S, but you have played on Series S, John.
I have. I've played quite a bit of Series S.
Can you talk about that for us?
Of course. So this one's interesting because at first glance, I was thinking, this is just the Switch 2 version. It's actually more nuanced than that. So first of all, Series S does run at a much lower resolution, and I actually got different counts depending on. So there's the inventory items were coming in like 576p, and those inventory items typically matched the internal res that we saw in the other versions. But in game, it was actually closer more often to 720p, right? Mm-hmm. But like PS5, it's just using spatial upscaling, right? Mm-hmm. Not proper temporal upsampling, and as a result, image quality is actually worse than Switch 2, like almost across the board. Like, it's just noisier, smearier, like DLSS canes it basically.
Right.
So this is definitely a case where Series S has the worst image quality of all the console versions, which is interesting. Right. It also lacks the strand hair like the PS5 and Series X versions, right? Mm-hmm. So you have the same sort of card hair system that we see on Switch 2. But in the other areas, it does actually have some of the features that aren't on Switch 2. For instance, you get the higher detailed character models, right? Mm-hmm. And more importantly, and this is probably the biggest one, the performance is really good. So unlike Switch 2, Series S is pretty much just like a very stable 60 FPS. So you do sacrifice a lot in terms of image quality, but it runs a lot smoother. So when, like, I can't imagine there's a big audience that is sitting here with like a Series S and a Switch 2 being like, which one should I buy? But if you are that person, it really just comes down. It's like quality mode versus performance mode when you put the two side by side, right?
Yeah.
In a way. Because like if you want better frame rate, go Series S. If you want slightly better image quality, go Switch 2.
Yeah, it's also just an interesting comparator for our purposes, and it's kind of like a benchmark for certain kinds of performance. And Series S has ended up
It is.
living a life beyond its own, just as a comparison point for our like handheld coverage, which is quite interesting. But yeah, to measure up against Series S this well, it's quite promising here, I think.
Exactly. So I think the big limitation with most console versions, except PS5 Pro, is that their image quality treatment is kind of worse than usual, just with that spatial upscaling, possibly just FSR1, which is in the
Right.
PC version, which is why we're thinking that. Because there really isn't any attempt to make those pixels look a lot prettier than they otherwise do.
Mm-hmm.
So you are basically looking at 720p-ish here most of the time. But still, you know what? Like I said, though, because of how well this game scales, even at really low resolutions, it still looks really good. And how good the Series S version looks does depend a lot on your monitor size, I will say. You know, it's the same effect with handheld PCs, right? Like when I was playing it in my capture window on my PC monitor, it's like, oh, this actually looks really great. But then when you turn around and look at like a 77-inch OLED, it's like, whoa, you know, it's completely like just, it's a blurry mess. So it just depends on the display a lot,
Yeah.
I think, the perception. But I guess technically, Oliver, it can scale even lower, can't it? Because we didn't talk about the Switch 2's handheld mode, which that's actually the first way I sampled it, and I was pretty impressed with it, especially once we found out what the internal resolution is, right?
Yeah, it's a pretty extraordinary little handheld experience, and like you said, that initial section when you're playing through the kind of city area looks extraordinary, like almost, unbelievable, almost, up certainly up there with the best graphical experiences I've seen on Switch 2, if not besting them.
Let's put it this way: when I look at this running on Switch 2 in handheld mode, I'm thinking like, okay, this is beyond what we would normally see like on last generation consoles, running on a little handheld. That's what it feels like, right? I think it's really, really impressive.
Yeah, it's just about there. And here, it's all the more impressive because the internal resolution of Switch 2 is just 360p on this mode.
A
So
resolution
like
common on
sub
Switch
SD.
1, by the way.
Common on Switch 1, but the results here are certainly much better than Switch
Much
1
better.
games that would have
Much
been running
better.
at 360p with no AA or TAA or something. Here you're getting DLSS. Because it's using DLSS, it actually looks quite clear, quite sharp, quite good looking, temporally stable. It has all those nice characteristics we expect from DLSS, just maybe a little bit less so than docked mode because it is running at a very low internal resolution, an extremely low internal resolution, but it actually produces a serviceable result. So like at this extreme end of things, the upsampling provided by DLSS can still do quite a good job here, which is quite appealing. The only thing I did notice, though, is there are some artifacts, kind of like a hatched artifact appearance on Switch 2 handheld in some areas, like in this room here, which is maybe an artifact of the reconstruction process operating from what is an extremely low resolution for this title. Just a little bit odd there. But other than resolution, I didn't spot too many obvious differences and tweakables between Switch 2 dock and handheld. Shadows look similar. SSR is again accounted for, maybe a little bit noisier owing to the lower resolution, but perfectly fine. They don't seem to be cutting out any major features here, which is great. They also seem to be aiming for the same 60 FPS target as docked mode, which is all the more impressive here, perhaps, they're going for it, all the more audacious here they're going for it. But it does drop quite a bit here, I would say. Now, I think
Sure.
VRR is working correctly
It
here.
is. I
Yeah,
think so too.
it is working. Like you can definitely feel moments where the game is slowly sliding between, let's say, 50 and 60 FPS. You can feel that increase in time between frames, but it's not like a jagged increase. You know what I'm saying? Like you definitely feel that VR kicking in.
It's smooth.
But the game does seem to have some over budget frames pretty frequently, I would say here, that can make the game feel stuttery in some areas. And I believe the game also drops flat out of the VRR range sometimes, because when you get into more demanding areas, all of a sudden the game is just like constant judder back and forth. It doesn't feel too great. I did some off-screen frame rate analysis just by hand as well. And in the very worst spot, that on Switch 2 docked was 30 FPS. I counted about 25 FPS there. That's an absolute worst case scenario again, but just showing you that it can go, all the way from 60 FPS at the peak down to about, 30 FPS, 25 FPS in the worst case scenario. So it is quite a variable frame rate. Again, there are a number of approaches they could have done to accommodate this. Obviously, LFC VRR would have been possibly a good solution here. It possibly would have helped. But I think probably a lower frame rate cap would have also helped all the more, just because 60 FPS target with these visuals is just pushing a lot. You're asking a lot out of Switch 2 at the moment. And I think that's not quite the right approach.
Indeed. But still, yeah, good results here. Unfortunately, I guess the one caveat, and this, because it's a dark horror game more than many games on the Switch 2, like the nature of the screen, it's very obvious. Like the black levels just aren't good, and the smeary motion, like it does, it tries, like the game supports HDR, but you're not really getting HDR on this screen, and you're certainly not getting the black levels you need for a horror game. But that's not Capcom's thing. Like there's nothing they can do about that. I'll just say that when, and hopefully if, a Switch 2 OLED comes along, this is going to be one of those games that really shines on there.
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, obviously on the Switch 2 screen front, this game does show off some of its worst characteristics just because it is so dark and it does look so glowy on that panel. Not too appetizing there, but it's going to depend on the area. There's a section of the game that we can't show you owing to embargo restrictions at the moment. A little bit later on, that is more in daylight, that it has larger city areas, things like that. So that wouldn't be as apparent there. But yeah, overall here, I think the sum of this game's parts is pretty good. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, exactly.
It looks a lot like the other console versions of the game. DLSS does wonders to keep image quality acceptable or even good, like genuinely good image quality for Switch 2 game. Yeah. And I love the way these Resident Evil games look quite often, especially since like 7, 8, now this 9, Requiem, obviously. They all look fantastic in my opinion. And of course the remix series with RE2. 3 and 4 remake, those are all terrific looking games. But on Switch 2, my only real complaint here is the way that Capcom configures their games sometimes when they are struggling a little bit to hit their performance targets. It's not my favorite. I would have loved a 40 FPS cap here, maybe even a 30 FPS cap, or at least just an option. I'm not saying make it mandatory for all players. I understand some people don't like that, but that would be my preference. Then on the Switch 2 handheld front, VR could have been improved somewhat, perhaps with LFC VR at 120 hertz output, something like that. That could have been substantially better here. This is a consistent problem with Capcom games, so I don't know what to make of this. I was actually reviewing some of your coverage, John, of Resident Evil Village back in 2021, and I think you were evincing the same complaint about the console versions of the game.
Although, in a bit of a monkey paws move, we actually did get an RE Engine game with a frame rate cap, if you recall. It was Dragon's Dogma 2. And guess what? The frame rate cap did not work well at all. It was a complete mess with horrible frame pacing, suggesting that even if they did implement a cap, it might not actually work.
Yeah. Well, that's the other issue.
Right? Like, it would be nice if we had a 30 or 40 FPS cap that worked correctly. But so that's a big ask, though. And we've never actually seen that in the RE Engine to date. Like, they have never shipped a capped frame rate with perfect frame pacing, as far as I know, right?
There is one exception that I can think of off the top of my head, which is Resident Evil 4 on iPhone.
What? No way, really? With
or at least pacing? It can lock to 30 FPS if you have a powerful enough phone or iPad with correct frame pacing throughout. Okay. I mean, more or less. I mean, maybe there's like a tiny bit of variance in the frame pacing. Like every so often you might get a 16 millisecond frame.
It's not like Dragon's Dogma 2.
No, it's much better than those titles. And I think also that Monster Hunter Wilds has a pretty well-behaved frame rate cap, at least if you do choose to toggle it there, because they do offer an unlocked mode as well in that title. Perhaps they could endeavor to fix that problem for this game. That would be quite nice.
But still, Oliver, I think overall, we're both happy with the Switch 2 version. I think that Capcom did a great job here, and man, this game is scalable. It's also beautiful. I talked about it in my previous video, but this is a really, really good Resident Evil game. Like, we
Yep.
haven't had an original Resident Evil title like this since, I guess, Village, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I love Village. I think it's fantastic. I think this is better, significantly overall. And they finally found an interesting way to sort of marry that, like, first person horror-y stuff from 7 and 8 with the more action-packed stuff you get from Resident Evil 4, and it's a good
Mhm.
balance, especially the places where it shifts, where you spend more of the early game doing the slower stuff, and then the later game gets far more action-packed, and it works. It's I like the pacing a lot, so good job on that one, Capcom, and you can enjoy it on Switch too. All right, well, thanks for that, Oliver.
Yes, likewise, John. Always fun to do. I feel like we've done like 4 of these or something in the
I
past
know.
month. We've done a bunch of these,
It's
but they're
it's
always
fun,
fun
though.
to do. Yeah, always fun to do with you for sure.
Especially, when we're finding stuff and sharing things on Slack, like, oh, did you see this? Did you see this? It's fun kind of playing detective on this and figuring out what every version has to offer.
Absolutely.
And this was no exception. So thank you everyone for watching, and we'll see you next time.